Okay, thanks. Have a seat. Welcome back. I'm very excited to introduce this next plenary session moderated by our new colleague, Satang Nabene from the Gambia. Satang has just moved to Dayton to be with us at the Human Rights Center as the Director of Programs. We are blessed to have her. She started as a youth activist in the Gambia, fighting for the rights of girls, and went on to get numerous degrees, which I won't list, in law, in the practice of law, in the human rights field. She was most recently with the Pretoria Human Rights Center, and we are super pleased to have her here. She writes extensively on issues of African democracy, on gender equality and women's empowerment, and as it links intersectionally to a whole range of issues. So over to you, Satang, and thank you very much for your moderation.
Sure. Where's the plan? Thank you very much, Shelley, and good morning, everybody. Can I just make a joke and say now welcome to the African Social Practice of Human Rights Conference. You do have 3 Africans on the stage, but that's just a joke. So welcome to you all in the room, as well as those that are joining us online for the first plenary of the SPHR 2021 on civil resistance and social movements of 2020. As Shelley said, depending on the context, if I'm currently in Africa, I'll still be considered a youth leader. So as a youth leader, I guess here I'm a former youth leader, but I'm not sure. I am super excited to moderate this hybrid. As you've seen, we have 3 of our speakers online and 2 here with us. In terms of the format of the plenary, this is what you will expect. We'll take a few minutes to do an introduction of our all-star panel. And then I have a series of questions that I'll ask the panelists, especially in terms of sharing their personal experience and their journeys in relation to civil resistance, as well as social movements in 2020. And then the second half of the plenary, we will open the floor both for those that are online, as well as those that are here to interact with the panelists. Does that sound good? Okay, great. So let's get started with our all-star panelists. First of all, I'd like to introduce Tatiana Shukoko, who is a researcher and queer feminist activist from Belarus. Currently, she's a PhD candidate at the Department of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. Her research interests include transnational feminism, post-colonial and decolonial theories, critical race studies, socialist and post-socialist studies, and politics of solidarity. Welcome, Tatiana.
Thank you.
The second person I'd like to introduce is on my right, Mutassim Ali, who is here in person as a human rights activist from Darfur. He began as a student activist in Khartoum, advocating to raise awareness about the atrocities in the region. During his studies in Sudan, Mr. Ali was detained several times by the former regime of Omar al-Bashir for his activism for Darfur. Mutassim was unfortunately, as Nathan Law was, he was also forced to leave Sudan and seek asylum in Israel, where he spent more than a decade as a refugee, but also as a very vocal voice for African refugees in that particular country. His current practice focuses on areas of international criminal law, international human rights and humanitarian law, child protection and transitional justice. He works with Project Expedite Justice and is a frequent consultant for the International Criminal Court, the ICC. You're welcome. I will also like to introduce Dr. Sirisha Naidu, who is an associate professor in the Department of Economics and affiliate faculty in the Race, Ethnicity, and Gender Studies Department at the University of Missouri, Kansas City in the US. She earned her PhD in the US and her BA in India. Her research is on agrarian change, environmental justice, and women's labor and work. She is a founder member of India's Civil Watch International, a transnational diasporic civil rights organization that is committed to fighting caste and gender oppression, state repression, and economic inequality, and building a more racial and just democracy in India and elsewhere. You're welcome. I'd also like to introduce Margarita Meru, who is currently an advocacy coordinator at It's Our Turn to Participate, which is a platform that promotes participation in the rewriting of the Constitution in Chile. She has led campaigns to engage youth and vulnerable groups in decision-making processes and has trained emerging leaders in several Latin American countries. She's a former Harvard Youth Fellow, which is a program from the National Endowment for Democracy Net. You're welcome, Margarita. And finally, but not the least, we have in person Alwia Sharif, who is the Training and Fellowship Manager at Ohio Voice, where she manages the Vision for Ohio Fellowship Program, which aims to train Ohio leaders and makers to tackle big systemic issues that affect everyday communities. In 2007, as a high schooler, she started her organizing career on a campaign to raise the minimum wage and learn how to advocate for young people in the system. Since then, she has worked in multiple sectors of the social justice movement, including helping to uplift the national movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. Thank you all for taking the time to talk to us today about your experience, especially in relation to civil resistance and social movements of 2020. We do know, and as I think the keynote very much highlighted, the interconnectedness of what happens in our various spaces and contexts, especially within the context of the coronavirus pandemic. It also very much shows, and I think, as Anne also highlighted before, that the social movement and the examples of civil resistance that we will talk about with our very distinguished panelists, are examples of civil resistance that we cannot ignore, that really illustrates the importance, as I said, of the interconnectedness of our world. These past few years have prompted unprecedented social movements in places like Belarus, India, Chile, and Sudan, which we will talk about today. For instance, Belarus has seen over this past year and a half a powerful popular uprising for democracy and also an extremely harsh series of crackdowns, on the other hand, by the dictator Lukashenko, who remains in power as of today. Tatiana, we would like to welcome you to share your personal narrative about the social movement in Belarus, especially in terms of what have been the main tactics, methods, and strategies that have been used in the protest, but also importantly as well, how the regime has countered these methods and strategies, and obviously with the role that you've played in that. You're welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this roundtable and to present my reflections and ideas about the protests in Belarus, and also connect them to the struggles in the other locations and transnational struggles and global struggles. So first of all, I want to say that I'm a scholar and queer feminist activist from Belarus, but the past years I have been pursuing my PhD in the US, so I haven't participated in the recent protests. However, my connections from activism allowed me to witness the protests very closely and stay in close communication with activists. So my reflections today on the protests are also informed by my constant conversation with activists on the ground. Though I haven't participated in this protest since the summer 2020. So I will explain the main methods, tools, or strategies that activists use, but also put it into the context, because the protests started in the 2020 and they're still ongoing, but they're changing. So there are many complexities and layers to how the protests are still going on. So during summer 2020, there was a surge in protests in Belarus against the authoritarian government that has been in power for 26 years since 1994. This uprising, triggered by the falsified presidential election of August 2020, has unfolded as a continuation of actually long-lasting public outcry against falsified elections, oppressive and unjust laws, economic crisis, and numerous acts of repression. Importantly, these protests were also sparked by the inability of the current government to handle the COVID-19 public health crisis. While the government refused to recognize the existence of the pandemic, there were grassroots organizations and community initiatives that consolidated material and human resources to support health workers. However, it was specifically this moment of elections that sparked the mass demonstrations, and the brutal response of the authorities fueled the mass outcry. The protests faced an unprecedented level of state and police violence. Law enforcement used tear gas, water cannons, rubber bullets, and stun grenades to suppress dissent. Many protesters experienced severe beating, detention, torture, and humiliation. Several people were killed by law enforcement, yet the state denied its complicity in this death and in turn blamed the victims. Demanding the complete overthrow of the paternalistic authoritarian regime, new and fair elections, release of all political prisoners, and accountability of the state actors for the perpetrated violence, protesters also called for solidarity from the international community. Recently, due to severe state violence, the protests gradually dissolved and dispersed across the city. So if in 2020, the protest started as a huge wave of mass mobilization centered in city centers, for example. So now these protests are mostly dispersed and centered in small neighborhoods, cities, locations. It gave people opportunity to still protest in different neighborhoods and avoid extreme violence from the police. However, the authorities started to target activists and organizations individually. As of late October 2029, there are 831 political prisoners. A total of 275 non-governmental organizations have been closed or liquidated. So actually almost all non-governmental organizations that were active now are closed and are supposed to work somehow on the ground or actually from the abroad. Law enforcement officers continue to detain peaceful protesters and other individuals for the use of protest symbols, including in private homes and territories. So now people can be arrested even on the grounds that they have protest symbols on them, some colors of the protests or some other symbols. Importantly, Belarusian protests were not homogeneous and united various groups: trade union, left-wing, anti-fascist, right-wing, nationalist, ecological, feminist, and LGBTQ organizations, parties, and individual activists. Under conditions of authoritarianism and suppression of political dissent, where the means of political activity are very limited, political differences sometimes seem unimportant, as collaborations and coalitions help members survive in hostile and adverse conditions. Nevertheless, these coalitions often led to narrowing down approaches and agendas in favor of more dominant nationalist and or liberal groups. For instance, the agenda based on abstract claims, sometimes using the language of human rights, for fair elections, these claims were usually done at the expense of claims for social and economic justice. However, the protests also included grassroots organizing that promptly developed new practices of political dissent and networks of mutual aid and solidarity to support local communities. As many scholars, activists, and writers and artists from Belarus underline, The current protests draw inspiration from local histories of resistance against fascism, imperialism, and authoritarianism. They are decentered, horizontal, localized, spontaneous, and agile. Protesters generate new forms and structures of organizing and cultivate mutual aid, community care, and networks of solidarity. Focusing on these features of the current protests, local actors attempt to challenge habitual modes of thinking about Belarus. For instance, an art curator and researcher Antonina Stibur and an artist and writer Alexei Tolstov emphasize, quote, in the situation of the proposed choice between two evils, the implementation of authoritarianism and the establishment of neoliberalism, we want to articulate the possibility of an alternative model, which is now being born from a technical basis and new alternative infrastructures. It's about the realization of a utopian but possible future horizon, end quote. The protests and activism against authoritarian state politics and practices significantly influence the spread of different forms of dissent beyond the street actions or political advocacy. The protests have already taught people a lot and actually changed significantly intercommunal relations and mutual support networks, and encouraged people to envision new forms of governance to ensure justice. While political advocacy is an undeniably important tool, I want to focus on an important sector of grassroots organizing that allows people not just to express dissent, but actually survive in extremely hostile environment. For example, the roots of the Belarusian uprising, among other things, lie in post-Soviet histories of grassroots organizing where women and gender non-conforming people played a pivotal role. Under conditions of severe economic, health, and political crisis, women's and queer people's long-lasting experience in grassroots organizing and mutual aid in ecological, human rights, LGBTQ, and feminist organizations actually influenced why the people were mobilized for political protest and facilitated the creation of multiple grassroots initiatives. So the spark and appearance of these mass protests and also the appearance of many grassroots initiatives is actually connected with these long histories of activism before the moment of 2020. Nowadays, in the conditions of severe political pressure and incarceration, where street actions are often impossible or too dangerous, the creation of underground network of support and mutual aid was an important moment of the formations of the solidarities of care. These networks also acknowledge different levels and modes of precarity that people could have experienced. For instance, I mean Telegram chats that allowed people in one neighborhood to connect and provide aid and support to each other in any situations that happened when authorities intervene or suppress certain communities. Also, the spread network of mutual aid groups, diverse art projects that are conducted on the ground for the neighborhoods again and for the communities, and projects that provide space for mental health recovery. So there is also a big network of activists that create spaces for people to gather and find space to recover their mental health affected by this extreme violence from the state. Many of these grassroots initiatives are invisible and want to stay unregistered and invisible for the state's gaze. That is why I'm not going to name the names or even go in any details about these organizations. They spread information about the activities by word, instead of focusing on macro politics that often exclude, for instance, women, gender non-conforming people, people with disabilities, and racialized communities from the agendas. These grassroots initiatives, in turn, try to center marginalized communities. Furthermore, the protests in Belarus actively facilitated the links of transnational solidarity. For instance, several events attempted to put the Belarusian uprising in contact with insurgencies, for example, in Turkey, Rojava, Hong Kong, Kyrgyzstan, Thailand, Nigeria, and many other locations. Transnational solidarity networks also allowed activists to escape persecutions and threats from the authorities by finding refuge abroad. However, what bothers me now especially is how these claims for transnational solidarity can be situated within transnational struggles. While asking for solidarity, people in Belarus often are not ready to express solidarity to other communities and locations. The current refugee crisis fueled by the Belarusian authorities demonstrate that anti-authoritarian claims often are not anti-racist, because many protesters expressed hostility and disdain towards migrants from Kurdistan. Although many activists in Belarus now are refugees themselves in other locations. This situation raises questions how claims for liberation against authoritarianism should be interconnected with broader claims for social and economic justice, both locally and transnationally. Thank you very much for your attention. Looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Tatiana, for that very eloquent, comprehensive. I know that we gave you quite a short time to do a whole comprehensive overview of what is happening in Belarus, especially in terms of civil resistance and social movements. And thank you for sharing the various examples of the practices of political dissent, but I think most importantly as well, in terms of how activists as well as people in the country are actually surviving in extremely hostile environments, including the circles or the solidarities of care in country, but also transnationally as well. And as in Belarus, over the past few years, Sudan has also saw a large-scale social movement calling for the ouster of long-term dictator Omar al-Bashir. However, unlike Belarus, as of yet, this movement did see Bashir removed from power. However, as of a month and a half ago, perhaps, there has been a military coup that sought to undo all of Sudan's strides towards democracy. I think this is a powerful example of the immense power of social movements, but also the precarity of these gains in terms of backlash and what happens later on. So Mutassim, as I think when I was introducing you, obviously you're very much the experience of what you've gone through is very much rooted in the work that you've done in relation to civil resistance and social movement. So if you can share with us what your specific role has been in supporting the democracy movement in Sudan, and especially given, as I said, in relation to the military coup happening, and what are the current challenges in light of that, as well as where you see the movement needing to shift based on the recent developments that are happening in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satan, for this wonderful introduction. And I would like to seize the opportunity to thank the University of Dayton and the Human Rights Center for offering this platform. And I think this is particularly in the context of Sudan, of course, for other places as well. This is a timely conference. And as we are speaking now, this morning, the Sudanese people are actually on the streets protesting. And I think this is really an incredible opportunity to highlight some of the struggles as the Sudanese people that we are experiencing. Just to give you a context for those of you who have no idea about Sudan, Sudan is East North Africa. And since its independence in 1955, actually 1956, the Sudanese people have been, actually until today, have been struggling to form a national identity. There is an acute crisis of national identity that generated genocidal wars, humanitarian catastrophes, particularly in a region called Darfur in western part of Sudan, and in South Sudan as now a new independent state. Then there are a couple of other regions, such as Blue Nile and South Kordofan. These are regions in Sudan where wars and sometimes genocide taking place. There are more than 2.5 million Sudanese people were killed as part of this, national identity crisis. In Darfur alone, there are nearly 300,000 people were killed. This is not by militia or just armed groups, but it is, sort of orchestrated by the government. There are more than 2.5 million people displaced just from Darfur alone, not to mention the other regions. And you can only see where the problem is. And so this national identity crisis is, if I can summarize, is reflected in two major distortions. Number one is racial and cultural self-perception by dominant ethnic groups as Arab. And the other is the imposition of Arab Islamic identity as a framework of a national identity in Sudan. And so these two major things sort of caused all the problems in Sudan. For much of Sudan's history, Sudan is dominated by military rules. Of course, we had several democratic governments, but the majority of the governments were military. We actually, there were more than 35 actually military coup attempts. 5 of them were successful. The latest was the former regime of Omar al-Bashir, who is now in the custody of the Sudanese government. It's been in power for nearly 30 years. And so during 30 years, this is where many people in Darfur were displaced and killed. Many people in South Kordofan, Blue Nile were displaced and killed. South Sudan separated from Sudan. And so as a result, Sudanese people sort of launched many armed groups, primarily to revolt against existing regimes, particularly Omar al-Bashir. In Darfur alone, there were more than 80 rebel groups against the central regime. Now you may ask me why we have many different groups if we have one shared goal, but I think, but the main thing here is that there are many movements against the central regime. And that's the same in other regions as well. And the reason why many people in Sudan picked up arms to revolt against central government, primarily central government of former President Omar al-Bashir, is that there was no chance for Sudanese people, particularly in the regions like Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile, to peacefully protest, right? Because they were seen as rebellions. They are unwanted, primarily because of their African identity. And so that's why the government sort of targeted, civilians. They government destroyed their villages, homes, right? Nothing remained. And therefore, I can tell you, my family is displaced now for nearly 18 years because our home is totally wiped out. And so that's one of the reasons why people pick up machine guns. Swiftly on to 2018. And for many people who are following Sudan, they see the 2018 as the revolution in Sudan. And I think there were many movements, even in 2013, people protested against the regime in Khartoum and other regions, but then they were brutally oppressed. Why 2018 is significant? 2018 is significant because Sudanese people from all walks of life, right, from Darfur to South Kordofan, from all parts of Sudan, all came and protested. With one voice, they say "Tasqudbas." In Arabic means, or in English, it can be translated to "just fall." They demanded the fall of the regime. And so most of the people participated in the protest, and actually until today, are young people and women. And this is unusual. And if you were to ask me, Before I left Sudan, I used to involve as a student, right, in organizing people, in protesting. And that's part of the reason why I went to prison several times. At that time, not many people were interested in involving in the struggle, right? For many people did not believe that there were actually people being killed because of who they are, right? In Darfur, for instance, people did not believe. I can tell you this, my classmates did not believe there was actually a targeted war against civilians in Darfur. This is in 2009. And for me, it was surprising to see everybody now is speaking about freedom, peace, and justice in Sudan, all the people in Sudan. And so for me, this is like a huge progress for the Sudanese people, to sort of, protest for a common goal, and that to realize other struggles in Sudan. And so as a result, in 2019, they removed the former president of Sudan, Omar Bashir. By the way, Omar Bashir is wanted by International Criminal Court for crimes committed in Darfur and other regions, primarily war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Because he's in custody of the Sudanese government, the expectation from the Sudanese people who removed him from power, people expect that Bashir will be extradited to the ICC. Unfortunately, the people who removed Bashir from power are actually military generals who are actually working with Bashir. They're in power, and so they said, we're siding with the Sudanese people. We removed the Bashir regime, and now we can help facilitate the transition into democracy. We're leading the government until there will be free, fair elections. Unfortunately, what they did was hijacking the Sudanese revolution. And so they're not interested until today to extradite Bashir. And what they did was on October 25th, they conducted a military takeover. And just to, maybe it's a little vague here to understand, but part of the removal of the former regime from power, they sort of formed a transitional government. It's half civilians and military leaders. And as part of that political deal, there are a few tasks of the transitional government. Number one, to promote accountability for those who committed atrocities, right? To hold the perpetrators accountable, and to sign peace agreements with armed groups in Darfur, South Kordofan, and Blue Nile. These are the regions where armed groups are. And finally, to prepare for elections. And as part of the political agreement as well, is for the military leaders to lead the transition for 21 months, and civilian leaders to lead the transition for the remaining period of time. And so because the military did not want to transition, they conducted the military takeover in October 24th. They're not interested in handing over power to civilians. They're not interested in democracy in any way. And there are two main reasons, I think, why they're not interested in that. Number one, most of the military leaders are perpetrators of atrocities in Sudanese regions. And that's why they fear accountability. And two, they're trying to protect their wealth. Not that they need more wealth, because they already have that, but the main aim is to protect their wealth. And that's part of the reason why they're doing everything possible not to, help the Sudanese people, complete their democratic transition. Where things stand today, the Sudanese people are continuing to protest and denounce the military coup. This is going to take, from my end, I think it's going to take a lot of time, because in the end, the Sudanese people do not have anything but themselves. The military has the power and has the money. And so for that reason, I think we'll see a lot more human rights violations, more people will be killed as they're doing now. And but people are determined and consistent in their demands.
Thank you, Mutassim, for. Yeah, we are definitely asking a lot of the panelists to give us comprehensive overview of what is happening in 10 minutes. So I do apologize to all of our panelists in relation to that. And thank you, Mutassim, for those insights into the Sudan situation. And as you can see with Belarus as well as with Sudan, these are countries that are run by dictatorships. From a personal experience, I grew up in a country where majority of my life was spent under a dictatorship. The Gambia was under a dictatorship until 2016 for 22 years. And whilst there wasn't necessarily, we kicked out the dictator through the electoral vote. And I think in a sense as well, and I think I do really connect in terms of your experiences in relation to the social movements and the civil resistance that are happening in both countries. But I think also going back to Jackie's, if I'm not wrong, Jackie's point earlier about how much you're willing to give up for freedom. And I think quite a lot of us, especially on stage, have given quite a lot, leaving our families behind, leaving our country behind, because we really wanted to ensure that we were playing and keep on playing our part in ensuring democratic gains in our respective countries, but also in the world in general. So thank you for those insights. And so transitioning from these two countries, then we do move to another two examples of countries that are not necessarily dictatorship, but we know that one is technically considered an autocracy by all measures, which is India. My categorization might be wrong, so Sirisha, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But then also we do have another country who by all measures is, at least on paper, democratic. And I think in a sense as well, the first two examples differ from the other two examples that we will talk about right now in relation to the fact that it wasn't necessarily focused on overthrowing a government per se, but one was about repealing legislation in India, for instance, and the other going so far as to rewriting the constitution in Chile. So first of all, we will hear from Sirisha, who can tell us more about the India's farmers' protest, which sought to repeal controversial farm laws that will privatize farming. In November 2020, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw that the gathering both by land-owning farmers as well as landless farm workers who gathered outside the capital of New Delhi for one of the biggest demonstrations in the world. And just last week, I believe these laws were repealed or announced to be repealed. And I'm sure Sirisha will tell us more about her role in supporting the movement from where she is right now, as well as telling us what is unique about the protest, about the farmers' protest movement in India. You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this invitation. And, I've been learning so much, you read, but then when you hear people and their experiences, that's a very different kind of learning. So I'm just learning from being part of this panel and hearing people talk about this. So the farmers' protests started in November of 2020. And recently they have won some measure of success. And I want to kind of preface all the remarks that I'm making by saying that the farmers continue to protest and continue to push for policies that are more friendly to farmers, but also in terms of food security, that is the way in which they have framed their protests. So the farmers were protesting really 3 farm bills that were pushed ahead and passed as legislation last year without very much discussion with the farmers or the farm workers or sort of any other groups of people who would be impacted. And essentially, the farm bills would have given corporations free rein, not just to enter markets, but also in terms of the kind of legal sort of provisions that were put into legislation were quite of concern for anyone interested in democratic states, and India is not in that place right now. So when the farmers reached also tried to appeal to the federal government that passed these laws. They were denied entry into the capital city of Delhi last year. And so they just camped on the streets outside of Delhi, 5 major highways. They blocked them. And the farmer movement really grew from sort of primarily farmers from 2 states, and then farmers from a 3rd state joined in, and really then it became a movement of farmers across the country. And for those of you who were following what was happening last year and early this year, you would have noticed that they were getting people across the world were in solidarity with them, farmers across the world, but also farmers organizations, people interested in agricultural issues, working in that realm, etc. So I just want to, excuse me, talk a little bit about the protest itself. Like I said, primarily farmers and farm unions from 3 states that abut the capital city of Delhi. So very early in the movement, the farmers formed something, an organization called Samyukt Kisan Morcha, which translates to United Farmers Front, of more than 40 farmers organizations. So it then became the negotiating body that issued statements, coordinated strategy and tactics, spoke to the media, and primarily had a 7-member coordination committee. The fascinating thing about this is that this coalition of more than 40 farm organizations has remained resolute for the last year and spoken with one voice, right? There was only one instance where a couple of minor groups left the coalition in 2021, but they have held strong for more than a year. This particular organization, which is called SKM, or the United Farmers Front, is also coordinating with over 500 farmers and farm workers unions across the country, and has also received support from many industrial and service sector trade unions. This is phenomenal because for anyone who has worked in a coalition, you know how difficult it is to maintain that kind of strong voice. And particularly under such intense pressure from the state, the media, and the urban middle class. So the protesters have been subject to covert and overt violence. From Tatiana, you were talking about tear gas and rubber bullets and that might of the state. And this is something that the farmers also had to face just for wanting to enter the city, which is the capital city and presumably open to anyone who lives in India. And so over 700 farmers died during these peaceful protests. Some of them, a couple of them actually committed suicide, but there have been a lot of deaths, despite the fact that the farmers themselves have been extremely peaceful, except for one particular incident in Jan 2020. So sham legal cases have been filed in order to intimidate farmers and their families. The Indian media circus has maligned the protesters by repeatedly calling them terrorists and anti-nationals. Now, this is a very serious accusation at any time, but particularly in India at the current moment where democratic institutions are seriously malfunctioning. So any criticism of the state or the party in power, which is the BJP, can land you in prison with a sedition charge, which is non-bailable. So last year, for instance, a 21-year-old climate activist, was imprisoned with a sedition charge for tweeting out a toolkit put out by Greta Thunberg in support of the farmers' protests. So the farmers' protests took place at a time when civil rights situation in India was looking very, very bleak. So while the situation was not necessarily that great even under the previous regime, the current political regime, which is the federal government right now, is under the rule of the BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist party, and not, has really made India into pretty much a police state, an autocratic state. Its advocates believe in sort of ultra-nationalism. Religion has become more and more the guiding principle. Religious minorities and the lowest caste, the Dalits, have been targeted. In 2019, before COVID, they also passed a very controversial amendment to the Constitution, which would essentially make Muslims second-class citizens in India. And that was also met with a lot of protests, which were ultimately dispersed because of COVID, and because, and the protesters, particularly in Delhi, had to then, face some very severe rioting, murders, etc. Because of, their standing up to the regime. So in this, since 2014, there's been lots of instances of sanctioned and unsanctioned violence. Writers, artists, musicians, even Bollywood actors and stand-up comedians have been censored, have been arrested, have been hounded. Social activists, legal experts, academics, poets, students have been imprisoned under sedition charges for raising voices of dissent. And so freedom of speech and expression and academic freedom seem very aspirational in India right now. And so it is under this context that the farmers came out in this force to demand their rights as citizens, but also as residents, because now the issue of citizenship has also become so contested in India. So I'm very hesitant to even use the word citizenship. So they have come out in terms of, demanding their rights as people who produce food for the country, as in terms of food security, and really in terms of, kind of expanding our notion of human rights, not just as the ability to live a free life, but also in terms of economic security. So what is really proved most effective and successful for this movement is that the farmers' protests have not just focused on the issues of farm laws, which is sort of the initial impetus, but they've really forced public conversation on issues of monopolization, increasing corporatization of agriculture, all into everyday conversation. So they have extended this critique of neoliberal policies that have celebrated privatization of privatization efforts in general, but they have really extended it to the privatization of healthcare, education, public services. They have begun this conversation about what is a public good and what remain public goods in India. So a second sort of significant aspect of the farm movement has been that the farmers have also been joined by the farm workers, particularly from one of the states. And this is sort of surprising because of the conflictual class relationship between farmers and, who are the landowners, and farm workers who are the landless peasants and, are typically from the lowest caste, the Dalit caste. And, so they have in the past really kind of, had a conflictual relationship. But what some of the farmers' unions have been doing over the last decade or more than a decade is that they have been at the level of the state, have been also working with the farm workers to really change that conversation about, what the farmers' movement in general should be fighting about, right? And so this sort of extended or sort of concerted efforts to really kind of force not just the issue of farmers, but also the farm workers who are in an even more precarious position. And it comes really from the state of Punjab, but really, to bring that to the national stage, right? To bring and say, hey, this, when we are talking about farmers, there are also the farm workers and that they need to also, or their interests also need to be discussed. We need to, so there's also an internal critique of how farmers have in the past and continue to treat farm workers as well. A third aspect is that women have taken on a very important role in the struggle, which is huge. If anyone knows anything about India, the situation of, the status of women in India has not always been that great. Even if you see a lot of Indian women around and in, positions, academic positions or positions of power, but really women have come out in a very strong way and establish themselves not just as those who support the protesters, but that they are protesters themselves. So you've begun to see this, the presence of women in a very prominent way in public spaces, as leaders or leading protest chants, engaging in or, sort of running the newspaper that they have produced for themselves, which is known as Trolley Times. So one of the editors and a prominent spokesperson is a woman. And so that has been pretty significant. And fifth, and I want to sort of mirror what that's...
Just to interrupt, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just aware of that we don't have a lot of time. And
I'm just going to wrap up.
Yeah, I also wanted to give opportunity to people here as well as those online to engage with you. I'm sure everybody has questions waiting as well. Yeah, thank you.
So the protesters have also, like what Tatiana said, have also collectively modeled an alternative political vision of, what would a protest site, they've been protesting for the last year. What would that look like with community kitchens, with, subverting gender norms, engaging in political education and so on. And so that has been, I think, one of the most significant aspects of the farmers' protests in the last year.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Sureisha, for that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And for especially we regard to the last bit about what you were talking about in terms of the critical and important role the women have been playing in relation to the movement that is happening currently in India, as well as I think India is a good example of the social practice of human rights itself in terms of methodology, which you mentioned in terms of coalition building and the farmers coming together and pushing for their demands, but also beyond just farm laws and addressing other critical issues in that particular sense. And now I'd like to turn to Margarita in terms of, and Chile, I guess, in relation to the protest that happened in October of 2019, which is also known as the October 18 movement in relation to what we witnessed with Chileans taking to the streets to demand for specific rights, in relation to education, pension, public transportation, and things like that. As I said before, Margarita is part of a group called Ahora Nos Toca Participar. Do excuse my Spanish, I'm sorry, I butchered that, which is Our Turn to Participate, which is a movement that resulted in the remaking of the Constitution. If you can share with us, I know as I said, we don't have a lot of time. If you can share with us in relation to the role that young people especially have been playing in the movement to remake the Constitution, and what sort of support have they received? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was well pronounced. So younger generations, we have to thank them for this new constitution we are drafting in Chile. They were the spark that lit the flame for 2019 social revolt that we had here in Chile, which then became a nationwide uprising. After the government raised the subway fare, secondary students jumped the turnstiles. It was a mass fairyration to protest in the name of their parents, of their grandparents who couldn't afford any more expenses. Chile is a country where wealth is very unevenly distributed. Only 1% of my country's population earns 1/3 of the nation's wealth. We are the most unequal country in the OECD. Here, costs of living increase constantly, but wages don't. And this fare raise was the straw that broke the camel's back. So students raised their voices when adults didn't dare to do it. And the police used force against the students. I'll never forget the image of a teenage girl in a school uniform bleeding in the subway station. This was not part of our democracy. The whole country was furious by this and by 30 years of a neoliberal democracy that only benefits the rich. We were angry at a system that doesn't seem to care for its citizens. It was like an avalanche once the discontent was set free, there was no way of stopping it. We said Chile woke up. We woke up, and people took to the streets. We had weeks of massive marches and demonstrations where we protested against the system, asking, as you said, for better pensions, healthcare, education, among many other social rights. And this is why we needed a new constitution, because our current constitution is illegitimate. It was imposed by Pinochet's dictatorship in 1980, and it defends a market-driven economy. It was written to strengthen private property over common well-being for citizens. So it was beautiful to see people come together in what we know is a very individualistic country because of our culture, because of the constitution and all of the legacy of the dictatorship. We left our houses and we discovered each other. We sat down in parks to discuss the changes that Chile needed. We met our neighbors. Throughout the country, we formed cabildos, the local neighborhood assemblies, a form of direct citizen participation. There was so much hope. Unfortunately, there was also much fear as well. Police repression in Chile, you might have heard about this. It became worldwide known with news of protesters losing their eyes because of the pellets they fired at the crowds. Now we count nearly 500 people partially blind from those protests. So it was a chaotic period, but all this movement brought about change. Political parties from left, center, and right reached an agreement, and they offered the country a democratic way out of the crisis, proposing to start a new constitution, a constitutional process. And this is where we walk into the scene. So I am here in representation of Ahora Nos Toca Participar. It's our turn to participate in English. We are a civil society project, a nationwide alliance of people and organizations working together to promote citizen engagement in the constitutional process. The way we see it, the 2019 revolt is the result of a frustration that built up during 30 years of exclusion. Citizens in my country were never part of decision-making. The beneficiaries of public policies and programs don't get what they need because they are not involved in the design. We could see this political disenchantment in the marches with signs and chants saying politicians decide between four walls. And that is what people feel, that they're isolated from us, that they're not listening to anyone but themselves. And the widespread perception was that they govern with their personal interest in mind, not the country's. So in this context, it was crucial to have participation at the very core of the process so that everyone could play a role to make the changes happen, especially the historically marginalized groups. Because we thought if we managed to raise the voices of those who have always been excluded for decades, we could actually change the dynamics of our society. So that is why from Ahora Nos Toca Participar, we work with people from all the 16 regions of Chile to involve women, youth, the elderly, the disabled, LGBTQ communities, people in prisons, indigenous peoples, migrants, and many other groups. They need to be a part of this. So we've done this promoting, for example, an informed vote for the plebiscite. We know civic education is necessary for a proper participation, and in Chile, we don't have either of those. So we held dozens of workshops to help people understand what a constitution is and why it was important to decide whether or not they wanted a new one. After a landslide 80% victory for the approval of going forward with the process, we are now drafting a new constitution. And here younger generations were key again, because they were the group that most grew in turn or vote out with a 56% increase related to the previous election. It was historical. Their feeling that they could influence changes was probably restored after the role they had during the revolt. We had a teenage council at the time in Ahora Nos Toca Participar, and it was impressive to hear them speak of all that was happening. They had a clarity I wish I'd had in high school of what needed to be done, of the things that were wrong, of the adult-centric worldview where they don't get enough space, and of the contributions they could make with their younger, fresher ideas. Our campaign to promote participation in the plebiscite featured these teenagers asking adults to go and vote because they weren't old enough to do it and they were dying to participate. Fortunately, our constitutional process has been more inclusive than all the other political spaces here in Chile. We have the first gender-balanced constitutional convention in the history of mankind. We're very proud of that. We also have reserved seats for our 10 different indigenous peoples. And we have been, from Ahora Nos Toca Participar and civil society in general, tireless in advocating for inclusive participation mechanisms. We want youth to continue being a part of this, and also all the other groups that I mentioned. So what we did is we had over 300 candidates for the Constitutional Convention commit to including good mechanisms that would allow us, all of us outside the convention, to help them out. And almost 1/3 of the people in the convention today signed our petition during their campaigns. So we are very proud of that. And we have kept contributing. Before the convention began its work, we held meetings to gather information from the different marginalized groups concerning how they wanted to participate in the process. It was important that the mechanisms consider the perspectives of the very people who were going to make use of them. And we wanted the excluded groups to make very much use of them. So we gathered that and we officially delivered those results to the president and the vice president of the convention. And we are very happy to see that the delegates shared our vision. Some of them, we know they used the information we gave them. And now we are having specific participation mechanisms for 11 different historically excluded groups. And of course, youth is one of them. They are even proposing that underage teenagers vote in the plebiscite that will ratify the new constitution next year. And we are now doing a similar exercise, bringing together communities from the different marginalized groups to reflect on how we want participation to be safeguarded in the constitution. We don't want a system where people are left out. We want a country that opens up spaces for all. And we will do everything in our power to defend the right to participation in the constitutional process and the draft. We work in alliance with many organizations, and that is where we get our strength from. All the people who have felt discriminated, who have remained and been silenced, are now joining forces to make ourselves visible to the constituent power. And the delegates, more diverse than any Congress in history in Chile, and chosen with the highest rate of voter turnout in years, are very receptive to this. So I am very hopeful of the results. The only threat to all of this is the possibility of an anti-democratic candidate winning the presidential elections in a couple of weeks. He has openly stated he's against the Constitutional Convention. So we are a bit scared about that, but we will continue to push for our agenda against all adversities, no matter the political context, because Chile needs these changes and we are not resting until they take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margarita, for beautifully illustrating, especially how young people spark the flame in Chile that has resulted to rewriting the constitution, and the work that you continue to do in terms of consolidating democratic gains in Chile. But I think also, just back to your last point, it very much reflects Nathan Law's earlier comment about, who was our keynote, about the earlier point about the precarity of democracy and how fragile it is, and that, you know, in terms of ensuring that we're in any case, with all the wins, we also need to make sure that we continue to ensure the consolidation of these democratic gains in light of democratic decline around the world as well. So thank you for those insights. And we've been around the world, from Chile to Sudan to Belarus to India, and we're back to the US. So welcome back. And so I think, we are excited to hear from Alwira, given that I think in many cases, especially within American discourse, that we do usually fail to view political events that happen in the US within a global lens or global perspective, especially in terms of analyzing their global parallels with what is happening around the world. I think obviously we're all familiar with the Black Lives Movement, which has been, you know, which has been around for years, but which also came to the forefront in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd, which also has global implications given the many protests that we saw around the world in relation to that particular that particular event. But also recently as well, the UN report also did note that racism in policing in the US could potentially be considered a crime against humanity. So there are definitely global implications in terms of what happens in the US. And so I turn to Alwia to share with us a little bit. I know we, as I said, we're very much limited in terms of time, but in relation to the role that you play and continue to play in the Black Lives Movement, the challenges, but also I think more interesting as well, equally interesting as well, is this in terms of how or in what ways do you see the social movements in the US as being similar to or distinct from the other ongoing social movement that you hear that we were just talking about. Welcome, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really honored and here with y'all. Yeah, my name is Awia. I go by she, her. I live in Columbus, which is an hour away from here. And yeah, I moved to this country as an immigrant when I was in my teens, and I found myself, you know, coming into a country with a legacy of stolen people and stolen land. And I think that is something that maybe we don't really understand when you're, you know, outside of the United States, right? It's like this idea of what the US is. And I think coming into it, really seeing the inequities that happen in this country, just even from one neighborhood to another, really illustrated to me, you know, what was really going on in this country. And it really fueled my activism. I started organizing when I was 17 in high school. And to be honest, it was really from like anger and frustration, right? Seeing how my community as immigrants were treated, seeing how other Black people, African Americans who, you know, are from this country have been treated, and found myself, you know, I didn't know it was community organizing. I just kind of was doing things. I always had a lot to say. And then eventually I was like, oh, I'm organizing. And I think even with that too, really understanding that it's a tradition, right, of civil resistance in this country. The movement for Black Lives is just another iteration. You know, George Floyd definitely catapulted a lot of activism in 2020. I got activated by the murder actually of John Crawford, who, you know, got murdered in a Walmart here in Beaver Creek. I think it might be like 20 minutes away from here. We had a lot of students who went to Wright State, went to Dayton, went to the University of Dayton. And so, yeah, it like really activated me and my friends and my comrades, and just seeing, you know, yeah, we were doing protests. I remember us having a banner that said, "Our lives matter, Black lives matter, Muslim lives matter, immigrant lives matter." And even our comrades were like, what do you, like, my friends and family are like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you so mad? Sit down. It's like, the world is on fire. Can't you see? This is back in 2013. It was actually, I would say, a few months before, oh my God, it's so sad. I can't even remember the names anymore. When Ferguson really erupted, right? Mike Brown was murdered. And so, yeah, so for me, I really want to ground us in that like, George Floyd is not the only name, right? This country has a long history of organizing and civil resistance that really comes from the Black community, because, you know, it's just been so difficult for so long, right? And it's really hard. I think having our leftist movements really have, how do I say, like, I don't think we've had a huge leftist movement in this country because of a few challenges, right? The two that I really wanted to kind of state, obviously there's many challenges, is really thinking about our electoral system, this idea of a two-party system and a winner-take-all system that makes it really difficult for movements to participate electorally, right? And also this idea of we don't really have a united working class in this country. Very much our movements tend to be rooted in middle class, right? And a lot of, I think the right has gotten really good at organizing the working class and really being able to take those ideals and weaponize them, versus I think our movements are not there yet, right? I think, which makes it really difficult, I think, for us to have a large scale movement, and partly because we're not, because of the two-party system, we're sort of under these huge tents, right? And there's a lot of discourse within that, right? You have people who are even within the left or the Democratic Party, however you want to say it, there's a spectrum to that. And so it makes it really difficult for us to have a united ideology and united strategies in order to build movements, right? Especially because also this country is huge. Some of our states are as big as other countries, right? So it's really amazing to hear what's happening in Chile, like rewriting the constitution and being able to have that process. I'm imagining what that would look like here, right? And it's almost impossible to imagine because it's like each of our states is basically its own little country, right? With its own rules and own cultures. And so it's just, this country is just massive, and the systems of oppression are just so deep and so rooted, right? Because of the history of colonialism and stolen people and stolen land, that I think that's something that I really had to figure out when I was getting into my organizing. I think I really thought, like, I remember just being like, it's gonna be a revolution. And then, in 2013, 2014, 2015, and then I got super burnt out. Like, I've been in the streets, I've had friends take their own lives. I've had friends, like actions, right, where people have passed away or have lifetime trauma. I'm traumatized. Like I have not participated in protests or marches in years now because I just can't do it, because of my experiences with it. But also recognizing that this is a marathon, right? This is going to be a lifetime struggle, and that I had to come to a realization. I had to actually mourn it and grieve it, that like I probably won't be free in my generation, right? I'm not going to see the freedom that I want to see, but we're fighting towards that, right? And so the way that I've been using my role at Ohio Voice, doing fellowship programs and doing a lot of trainings, is really getting other young people and other organizers in the communities in general to really understand that this is, we've inherited this, right? And also to recognize that these are systems that have been built. The way that I kind of talk about it is I talk about the US, and I would say most of like Western civilization at this point as, the master's house, right? Which is built up of these three capitals of white, these three pillars of white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And these pillars hold up this country. And as movements, we try, ultimately, I would love to just knock all those pillars down and start over, but we know that we have to organize, right, and chip away. And we all have different ways of chipping away at those pillars. But also being able to, I think a challenge in our movements here is like, again, we're not really rooted in that ideology, right? And that civil resistance history. And we know that it's also because of those systems, right? I don't know, have y'all heard of the Pow Memo at all? So the Pow Memo was written, I think it was the 1970s by, Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice judge, and he was tasked to write a memo to the business commerce in the federal government around, the attack of, the civil resistance was happening at that time, the 50s and 60s. And so they saw the threat of leftist movements, right? And so they really wanted to instill this idea of corporation and capitalism as the light of this country. And so he wrote a very detailed memo of how to, slowly start shifting to the right from campuses to schools, right? K to 12 education, to jobs, to media. And so this has been an attack on our communities. They've seen that the power that people have had and have slowly been trying to chip away at that. And they have been planning this. They have organizations like ALEC. They've been very well organized. And so it's just really, you know, for us, it's like all we have is the people and each other. And to be able to really, you know, keeping up the pressure. And recognizing that we have been winning, right? Even seeing the last few years with the rise of Trump and the conservative movement to the right, I believe that that's a reaction to, you know, to the movements of the movement for Black lives and the civil rights movement. You know, it swung to the left, and now it's kind of swinging back. And so it's really hard right now. It's hard to breathe sometimes, but recognizing that it's gonna swing back and really being able to be organized and recognizing that I think it's a particular context in the US as well. Because sometimes, like the way I talk about it, I feel like we're in the belly of the beast, especially when you're thinking about, again, white supremacy, capitalism, that, you know, we export these things to other parts of the world, and yet we live in it, right? And so it becomes this really intense contradiction, especially for Black people in this country. And so I'll just leave it at that because I timed myself. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alwir, for those insights as well. And I think also just drawing from what you shared in terms of the fact that the work that we all do, those that are here virtually, as well as all of you and those outside of this room, I think it comes at a heavy price. And solidarity is important, whether in the US and across the world, across activities. And I think this is what this space is really about in terms of bringing people together and sharing, especially. And I think as rightly with the theme of the conference, given the pandemic, what has grassroots organizations, especially in terms of organizing and tactics and strategies, have been doing in terms of pushing the envelope in relation to civil resistance, social movements, but also just in terms of promoting and protecting human rights across the world. I'm sure everybody is tired of hearing my voice. At this point, I will like to invite any of you that might have questions for our very fascinating panel. I think you will all agree with me that they are fascinating, and their answers and their personal narrative and stories are very insightful in terms of what is happening around the world. And as there are connections, as I said, in terms of what is happening, the global implications, but also, as you can see, the interconnectedness of all of this within the particular space that we work in. Do we have any questions online or in person? Okay, we have Paul.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm not sure you can see me on the screen, but wonderful coordination by Sotong of this panel, wonderful stories. I want to just issue an invitation. You've all shared so much about the reversals, the gains, the prospects for movements in your particular context. Are there any connections you're seeing in the stories that you've shared, whether it's about what advocacy can look like or what a vision of government or justice might look like in your context, whether it's about how do you deal with thinking that you won't achieve freedom or justice in your generation, or if you're more optimistic. So just an invitation for you to talk to each other a little bit. And I know there's not a lot of time, so.
Sure. Thank you. So what I'll do is I'll try to take 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll have the panelists just in terms of wrapping up the plenary to answer those questions and wrap up. Yes, Lada.
Hi, thank you so much. I'll be very brief for time, but my question is, for several of you mentioned the role of women in these movements. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about the tactics, strategies, and methods in advocacy that you see women in particular using that may be distinct. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, so we'll take the last question, and then we'll have a panelist do a wrap up.
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm going to direct a question at you, Alway, and I'm not challenging you in a way based on my own thoughts, but I heard your exchange with Margarita and what is happening in Chile and how you're fascinated by it. I've worked a lot in Latin America, and I believe in a methodology of organizing that comes out of Latin America. Most of my work is done in Brazil, but I've been to Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Honduras. I've been all through Latin America. I'm challenged with organizing. I bring a critical perspective about our methodology of organizing here in the US because it is done through funding from foundations. And I think that boxes us in a way that doesn't allow us to do what our communities need, right? But I see in places like Latin America or in the Far East, I work with Filipino domestic workers in New York who don't get paid. Organizing has become professionalized in the US, and I think it's part of the problem. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that, because some things I've heard from you, it seems like, there's some disenchantment from certain points of view. So thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you all for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I, as I said, that is all the time that we have to take the questions. So I'll go around, perhaps starting with Tatiana, and I'm gonna be very strict. I'm giving each person about 2 minutes to answer which of the questions you think, as well as in terms of just wrapping up. Thank you. Tatiana?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the questions. There are a lot of things I want to say, but I will stick to two probably main points. So I think that our conversation invites a lot the question about the solidarity and how to build solidarity between these diverse and different struggles. And I think that important question is that we all our struggles are affected by the global operations of imperialism, capitalism, and also the rise of authoritarianism in many locations. And through these instances, we can search for connections and for some sustainable relations. Also, I must acknowledge that it's not easy. It's a very hard way to build these solidarities. And especially in case of Belarus, I see a lot of roses and problems why this transnational solidarities never happen. And this is the main issue which I try to explore now, and to think how East Europe that is connected to Western Europe, but at the same time is quite different and is also under the imperial pressure from Russia and European Union, can find these ruptures of its marginalization to connect to other struggles. And the other aspect and question about the women's participation, I think that especially in Belarus, and I hear from other speakers also that women and actually queer people are on the vanguard of many organizing, and they create many alternative initiatives that not only provide people with alternative ways how to express dissent, but also create a huge network of caring, support of each other, mutual aid, and so on. That is very important in the times when these struggles are so long. It's not one day, it's a year, many years, 20 years, 30 years. And these networks are so important, but they are often invisible in the conversations about the politics, political advocacy, geopolitics, and so on. And I think that in Belarus, there was this moment when finally in the public space, we saw more conversations about the role of this grassroots organizing from especially women and gender non-conforming people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tatiana. Mutassim, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. I think from the conversation we had in the morning with myth and law, I think there were a lot of common things. And one of the things that I really sort of find it really interesting is the tools the authoritarian regimes use to silence voices, right, to press people and so on. And I think that's really relevant to the other struggles. And I think I will add very much to what he said, like basically these kind of struggles are really difficult and tough. And one thing that, we can all share is that taking it bit by bit, I think you can't really make a massive change at once. And I think that's really one of the interesting things. Quickly to women's participation in the Sudanese revolution. I think this is really surprising, especially in a patriarchal society. Sudan is women's role in Sudan particular, and I think this is in some other African countries as well, that to stay at home, right? Like that's the only thing that they do. And so to see them all of a sudden, right, marching in massive numbers, I think that's really surprising, not only for, international audience, but also, for Sudanese people. And so that sort of really inspired many Sudanese people, right? Young generations and so on to participate in the revolution. And so I think that's really, they play a really significant role. And, one of the things that really, is driving them to participate in such movement is also to advocate for their rights, right? Like they can do more than just staying in the kitchen, right? And so I think that's really special.
Thank you. Suresh?
I promise not to go over time this time. So I want to kind of mirror some of what Tatiana has said, and of course, some of what Tassim has also said, is that in terms of what I see as a common thread is the intense amount of solidarity across. So people are paying attention to different movements across the world and are drawing from it. In the Indian case, the solidarity was not just, or people have begun, our social movements are paying attention to what is happening in the US, what's happening in Chile, what's happening, elsewhere, and drawing from it and, sort of, discussing it. But there's also sort of building solidarity even within the country. Alvia, you talked about the US and how, it's so diverse. I mean, India, like very strong subnationalism and, parochialism. And of course, there are, at least 32 official languages, right? So, like language is a barrier. So how do you draw solidarity, right? The other thing that I find very sort of, heartening is that a lot of the change that is happening, if there is change happening, is coming from the ground. You can't legislate change. Change has to come from the ground. So, that is what's happening. I think legislations are important and they're supportive or play a very important supportive role. But really, whether we're talking, the change in legislation itself, in the case of Chile, for instance, is happening because of the movement from the ground, right? So, that is very important. And in terms of women's participation,
So
and
like 15 seconds.
yes,
Because I am a gender activist, so I'll give you 15 seconds because you're
absolutely.
talking about.
And that is part of the change, right? You can't change society if you don't also change gender ideologies, right? So that is part of the change. That's it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Margarita?
Hi, yeah. So I want to use my last 2 minutes to tell you about the parity in our convention. So I mentioned we have the first gender balanced constitutional convention in history. That is exclusively because the feminists movement here, they did their job. I mean, they worked tireless. I was very impressive. They came together all over the country and they fought for the constitutional reform that decided all the constitutional process for it to change. And it was changed. And they needed a lot of people in Congress to vote for that, to change and to include, for the first time in Chile's history and also the world, half of women in the convention. So it was beautiful to see that. And I just really wanted to mention saying that because it was very important in how we are shaping this new country that we want, like the changes we want. And the feminists have been so important, so relevant. And I just needed to say it. And please do look into that. They were months asking for this and they managed to get that law passed, the reform for this to change. And that meant for many men, and well, not that many actually, but many men who had been elected in the first, like the first election, there were corrections made to that so that we could have half and half. But also what this, the effect that this law had was that parties and people who chose the candidates actually put women who were competitive on the lists, which never happens. So we had a chance of winning, and we won, and we have great women in the convention doing an amazing job and putting all the perspective that Tatiana was also mentioning, like the cares and personal life and the importance of having a balanced distribution of work. I mean, it's beautiful. Please do look into that if you have a chance.
Thank you so much. And Leah, you have the last word.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, directly answering your question, you're right. I'm not gonna challenge because I even think about myself, you know, like I always joke, I'm a professional organizer now, right? I work for a nonprofit and I, you know, do training. Grateful for my position because I really am my organization, because I think that we genuinely try to support the movement and support those that are going to be the next generation with resources, training, whatever. But also I joke that like if my 17-year-old self saw me right now, they would like spit at my feet for being a sellout, right? And so I'm constantly facing that contradiction too, because we do need resources to do this work, but we also know that the mechanisms aren't set up that way. And I think things are shifting, right? We have folks that are really trying to shift it, but it's definitely not at the scale that it is. And for me personally, something that I still stick with is sometimes it doesn't feel like the people on our side are really on our side, right? So that might be a conversation we need to have later. But I just question some of the folks that are in the left, right, or that are liberal or whatever. It's like, do you actually want to win, right? If white supremacy were to end, if capitalism were to end, you are also going to lose some things, right? And so I think that's a real, that big tent, right, that we have to talk about. We still benefit from capitalism in our movements and individuals and in this country. And so really, yeah, that's something that is a constant contradiction. And one more point about what I see the similarities, yeah, I would say is the state repression against activism. Hearing the stories about the rubber bullets, the macing, like we saw that right in 2020. We've seen that here in Ohio. Actually, there's some laws that I don't know if it's already passed, but some bills that were introduced that would basically allow the state to sue individuals for protesting. Also, if there's at least 5 or more people that are protesting, that can be considered a riot and it's a felony. So that's happening here in Ohio right now. And so repression is real, gerrymandering, right? Our votes being taken away. And so we all need to be really paying attention to what's happening here as well.
Thank you. I couldn't close it better. Thank you so much. Please do join me to thank our very fantastic panelists and for their very inspiring stories. Thank you for taking the time to sharing your personal narrative and what is happening in your various countries, but also just reiterating the interconnectedness of all of that and the global implications of what happens in the spaces that we occupy. So that, and please do use the QR code for reflection for this plenary. And this brings us to the end of this plenary on civil resistance and social movements. Instead of 15 minutes, now you have 10 minutes break. And so feel free to grab coffee and snacks from that side of the building. And we will start with the concurrent sessions in 10 minutes. Students will be along the hallway to guide you into the correct elevator or stairs, and the classrooms all in the 2nd floor, and they are all labeled as well on the doors. For all concurrent sessions are going to be upstairs with the exception of new pathways in transitional justice. If you're a speaker or you want to attend that session, please stay here. Thank you and enjoy, and we will reconvene in the